What do you mean Leroy Jenkins is a terrible battle cry? I used it at my wedding. And that, by the way, is a 100% true story. Today, we're going to be taking a storyteller's look at the new book for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, Battlecry, on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello, travelers and tourists. My name is Mark, and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller that thinks every story is better with siege engines. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome to a storyteller's review of Battlecry for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Battlecry is the latest book for Pathfinder 2e. It dropped at Gen Con this year. And not only did I get to pick this book up at Gen Con, but I actually got to participate in Paizo's Battle at Hell Knight Hill. So I actually got to see the troop combat rules from this book in action at Gen Con. And what I want to do today is take a look at this book, give you an overview of what's found inside this book, and help you understand what kind of stories this product can help you tell at your gaming table. Now, the TLDW for this product is pretty simple. I think this is a fairly solid product. It is definitely a player-facing book. It is filled to the brim with new options for players to use in their Pathfinder 2e games, and all of them are centered around this war theme that is core to the identity of this book, and Paizo has brought a lot of fun and interesting options for players to use. The overall utility of this product may vary a bit depending upon the preferences of your table. So, for example, not every table is going to be able to make use of siege engines and troop rules and things like that, and if those rules are not something that's going to be beneficial for your table, you may find portions of this book aren't particularly practical. But there is still going to be content that every table can take advantage of, especially the two new classes, the Commander and the Guardian. So overall, I think this is a solid product that does a good job of delivering new content for players, and it effectively opens up some new scenarios that storytellers can use at their gaming table. So overall, I'm pretty happy with what Paizo provided here. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. So first things first, let's take a look at the table of contents and take a quick overview of what you can expect to find inside of this book. Taken together, I think chapters 1 and 2 are the primary selling points of this book. Chapter 1 is called Conquering Heroes, Chapter 2 is called Banded Together, and these represent the options that I think player characters are most likely to make use of at your typical gaming table. Conquering Heroes is going to introduce a new ancestry called the Jotunborn, some new battle backgrounds, and then two new classes, probably the biggest selling point of all for this book, the Commander and the Guardian. Then in Chapter 2 you have Banded Together, which is basically a selection of battle-themed options for player characters to use. The lion's share of this chapter is going to be new archetypes that are presented in this book. You have the Commander and Guardian multi-class archetypes, along with 8 new specific archetypes that player characters can make use of. Then you have some other character options, including followers, battle magic, and low-key one of the things I think's easy to overlook, but definitely is amazing to have, siege rituals. Next up in Chapter 3, you have Instruments of Battle, and this chapter I think is still going to be applicable to many groups, because it's going to have a lot of equipment that player characters can use. New magic armor, new magic weapons, ammunition, banners, special held and worn items that characters might be able to use. There's going to be a selection of things that PCs might want to carry into battle with them. Additionally, in this chapter, though, and where Chapter 3 starts out, it starts out with siege weapons and battle vehicles. Now, I love both of these, and I think they are a ton of fun, but I will admit that siege weapons and battle vehicles, while very cool, are also very limited in terms of the types of stories where you can use them. So definitely happy to have them. They are a cool inclusion in this book, but realistically, there may be some limited narrative options where these things can be brought into play. Finally, you have Chapter 4, The Art of War, and the big thing here is called Skirmish Warfare. This is an adaptation of the Pathfinder 2e rules that allows you to control troops battling one another across a battlefield. So this moves beyond individual character combat to larger units moving together and fighting together. Skirmish Warfare is going to give you the rules for this, and then the section labeled Garrison is going to give you several sample troops that you can use to quickly build your own battlefield scenarios. I'll talk about this more when we get to Chapter 4, because I actually got to see these rules in play at Gen Con, so I have some thoughts on this chapter. Overall, definitely a good inclusion. I definitely think that Chapter 4 is the most narrow chapter in terms of when and how tables can use it, but it is still a fun inclusion in this book, and I do think that the Skirmish Warfare is something that a lot of groups are going to want to break out from time to time. So now that we have an overview of what this book has to offer, I want to dive into each chapter and give you a quick sample of some of the content in this book. I'm not going to be looking at every single item, just because it would take way too long, but hopefully it will give you a little bit of a taste of what to expect if you pick this product up. The book Battlecry opens up with a section called Cry Battle as its introduction, and this gives you a little bit of an update on Golarian's story overall. Last year, the deity Gorum was killed, and you would think with the death of the god of war that would actually get rid of war, but quite the opposite has happened. Following Gorum's demise, pieces of his body have fallen all across Golarion, and massive wars are now breaking out as people are fighting for these divine artifacts that they are hoping to twist to whatever end they may have. This section talks a little bit about what to expect with the book, Skirmish Warfare, and the idea of bringing war into your campaign. And it also comes with a brief content warning about the subject of war itself. Now, I realize that content warnings can be a little bit of a hot topic on the internet, but essentially what this section does is Paizo specifies that Battlecry is approaching war stories from the perspective of the heroic tale. Kind of the old, noble charge in battle. The concept of war as an opportunity to achieve glory and do great things. Paizo is very much focused on that more classically heroic narrative surrounding war. However, they fully acknowledge that that is far from the only war story that could potentially be out there. In real life, war is hell. And they do kind of talk about that dynamic and how this book approaches storytelling around war. And I'm going to be honest, I feel like Paizo does a good job striking the balance here of acknowledging some of the classical stories that are being mimicked in this book, while also dealing with some of the emotional hang-ups that could be attached to the word war. Overall, this isn't a very big section, but I do think Paizo does a good job of balancing this conversation, so I wanted to call it out and give kudos to Paizo for handling this topic, I think, pretty professionally. The three major player character options presented in this book come in the form of a new ancestry, the Jotunborn, and then two new classes, the Commander and the Guardian, which are both martial classes inside of Pathfinder 2e. And here's a quick snapshot of what these particular options are all about. Jotunborn are forged from the blood of the ancient titans. The Commander is a battlefield leader who uses clever tactics to help their allies, and the Guardian is the best protector, period. That is exactly what the class is supposed to be. After this, you get a quick introduction to the Jotunborn. If I have to knock Battlecry for anything, I'm gonna say, overall, I'm not a very big fan of the artwork in this book. Like, most of the artwork for the Jotunborn just does not sell this ancestry for me. Descendants of the Titans sounds cool as all get out, but for some reason the art just doesn't land for me very often. With this guy down here being a notable exception, this guy looks cool. This is probably my favorite piece of the Jotunborn artwork in this book. Still, as I mentioned, the Jotunborn are essentially descendants of the Titans. There is a lot of lore around their role as protectors, and their strange recent trip to Golarion, which was triggered in part by the death of Gorom and all of the wars that are starting to take place. You get a discussion of their attributes, their starting traits, and all of the other things that go into your typical ancestry. You're going to get 5 different heritages for the Jotunborn. Those are the Keeper Jotunborn, the Planehopper, the Sage, the Warrior, and the Weaver Jotunborn. One particular note about the Jotunborn is that they raise creatures known as Ivlar, and use their silk to weave a lot of different things, and even weave the silk into their own bodies for certain effects. And there's a lot of stuff that plays off of this master craftsman with silk ability that the Jotunborn have. So you kind of get this interesting dichotomy on the Jotunborn. I've heard some people refer to them as gentle giants. They're large, they're strong, they've got a lot of power, and they definitely have a protector mentality, but they also have just this very gentle caretaker side to them, and I do think that makes for an interesting push-pull dynamic in their personality and can lead to some interesting characters. Of course, as with any ancestry, you're going to get a list of ancestry feats. One thing that I think is fun with the Jotunborn is you get a lot of crafting related feats. Like, one of their first level feats is called Caretaker's Restoration. This is a free action once per day. An item that you're holding, wearing, or wielding becomes broken but not destroyed. The effect of this feat is: the stewarding abilities of your forebears allow you to repair objects important to you. The triggering item is restored to a number of hit points that is 1 higher than its broken threshold. For example, a steel shield with a broken threshold of 10 is restored to 11 hit points. So this is just like a free ability once per day. Somebody breaks your stuff and you're like, no, I don't think that happened. And they do get a lot of like crafting oriented caretaking abilities. I think that's a fun niche for this ancestry to have, and that's just something I wanted to highlight for this ancestry. Also, another ancestry feat that really stands out for the Jotunborn is Jotun's Heart. And this feat is going to allow you to become a huge size character, and when you use another feat called Jotun Battle Stance, it actually gives you 10-foot reach as well. So if you want to control basically all of the battlefield, there is a Jotunborn ancestry feat selection that lets you do just that. Next up, you have some battle backgrounds. Most of these would be common backgrounds like Battle Mechanic, Combat Chaplain, or Quartermaster. And then you also have some uncommon backgrounds, things such as Aeronaut or Battlefield Scrounger, that are going to dig a little bit deeper into some of the options found in this book. For example, Aeronaut's going to give you piloting lore in case you plan on using a lot of those vehicles that we mentioned earlier. Up next, you have your new classes. This is the full-page artwork for the new Commander class. The Commander is an intelligence-based martial class that centers around the use of tactics in battle that can aid your allies. Many people refer to classes like the Commander as what they call near martials, because this is a martial class that doesn't use strength or dexterity as its core ability. Its key attribute is intelligence, which means that their accuracy relative to other martial classes will be a little bit lower, which means that in play you're going to want to lean into more than just the straight combat abilities of your character to get the most out of this class. Still, with a name like Commander, you probably saw that coming for this class, because at the end of the day, it's not about you dishing out the damage so much as it is your ability to help your team become more effective across the battlefield. I hope to come back and do in-depth looks at both of these new classes in the future, but two of the big abilities for the Commander are going to be the Commander's Banner and the Tactics. The Commander's Banner gives essentially an emanation around your banner that you can use to buff your allies a little bit. And then tactics are going to be these commands that you get to call out that increase the effectiveness of your team. And one thing I will say about the design of the commander is your teammates get to choose if they participate in a tactic. If you give an order to do something, it benefits your allies if they do it. So one of the good things is they didn't turn the commander into a controller of the team. It's not like you're taking autonomy away from the rest of the party. You're just helping the party be more effective when they are working in tandem, and I do appreciate that Paizo was cognizant of not letting this class kind of override other players' decision making. Now, as I said, I'm not deep diving the options in this video. I just want to highlight stuff that stood out to me, and one thing that definitely stood out to me for the commander is this feat, Peerless Mascot Companion. The commander has a line of feats that gives them access to an animal companion, and yes, you can turn that companion into the party mascot. I 100% expect my players to try to pick this up as soon as possible because they always want a party mascot, and having a party mascot bear or some other animal is definitely something my players would do. Next up, we have the Guardian, which is going to be the defense-oriented martial class. It is a strength-based martial class with a base of 12 plus Constitution modifier hit points at first level. This class is about as tanky can get inside of Pathfinder 2e. If you like playing defense, this is straight up the class for you. So at first level, here's a quick list of the abilities you're going to pick up. Guardian's Armor, Shield Block, Taunt, Ever Ready, and Intercept Attack. This should tell you exactly the flavor that the Guardian class is going for. This class is all about protecting yourself, protecting your allies, and debuffing enemies that are paying attention to anything other than you. As someone whose favorite character on World of Warcraft used to be a Prot Paladin, I love abilities like Taunt, and I think this class could be a lot of fun for someone who really enjoys that protector role at the table. I think this class looks very interesting. And again, I'm not looking at all of the abilities of the Guardian class in this video, but just to give you a sample of some of the options, one of my personal favorite abilities of the Guardian is the level 12 feat called Armor Break. This is a 2-action activity where you just flex really hard and you shatter your armor and create this 10-foot emanation around you of 11d6 piercing damage because your armor explodes and the fragments are just tearing into everybody around you. That is so awesome. Practical? Probably not, but is it amazing? Yes, I think it is. After this, we move to Chapter 2, which is called Banded Together. And like I said, the majority of this chapter is going to be archetypes. You're going to get the Commander and the Guardian multi-class archetype. Both of those are things we expect to be in this book. But then there are 8 additional archetypes that are included in this product. And I actually have a video deep diving one of my favorite new archetypes, which is the Munitions Master. This is a class archetype for the Inventor that lets you walk around with a siege cannon as your primary weapon. If you want to see an absolutely amazing class archetype that includes rocket jump, check out the link in the video description because I think this one is a lot of fun. Another new archetype that I think is very interesting is the Field Propagandist archetype. This is essentially a journalist, a town crier, a herald, somebody whose job is to spread information, but you've taken that job of spreading information and used it as a way of basically spreading tales about your allies in order to make them better. You gain an ability called Spread Propaganda, which you can use to basically seed information across the community that might overwrite the results of somebody else's gather information checks and can be used to kind of shape someone's perception of you and your allies. Another ability you have here is called Fabricate Truth. You get the idea of the Field Propagandist as sort of this cunning, deceptive individual who is misleading their foes in order to gain an advantage. Personally, one of my favorite abilities from the field propagandist is the level 6 feat called Invincible Army. This is a single action activity usable once per round, and essentially what you do is you just point at one of your allies and use deception or diplomacy to tell a story about that ally that makes them sound so amazing that you just give them damage resistance. Like, you tell a story about the party paladin charging through a storm of arrows, and for the next round, they get resistance to piercing damage. Or maybe the barbarian shrugged off a dragon's breath attack, and now they're resistant to fire damage. It's just single action damage reduction for a party member every single round. There's no limit to its use. You have to succeed on a skill check, but there's no limit to how often you can use this, and I absolutely love this ability. Invincible Army basically just turns you into a hype man for the other members of your party, and it's wonderful. There is a section in this chapter on followers. Followers are a special type of NPC companion that works similar to an animal companion. I don't want to get into followers here because it's a little bit of a bigger conversation, but if you use some of the options in this book that allow for a follower, this section is going to give you details on some of the followers you can potentially take. So for example, if you want a berserker as a follower, here's the rules for that. Next up, you have a section on battle magic, which is going to give you some new war-themed spells that characters might be able to take advantage of. And while there are certainly a lot of really fun spells in this section, my personal favorite is probably Holy Host, which is a new incarnate spell that allows you to summon a host of angels to join the battle on your behalf. This is just a perfect flavor win. I love that this spell was added to the game, so bravo on adding Holy Host. I absolutely love this. You also have a brief section on siege rituals, which gives you access to ritual magic that could be useful in a siege combat scenario. And a good example of this is the Encroaching Woods ritual, which allows you to use nearby woods to cloak the movements of you and your allies. So basically, you get a forest that follows you around and covers you wherever you're going. Chapter 3 is called Instruments of Battle, and as I mentioned earlier, the equipment section of this I think is going to see some pretty regular use. For example, you have new weapons like the Battle Lute or the Lion Scythe, along with new adventuring gear like a War Saddle, and a healthy section of new magical items. So here you have magic armor, magic shields, magic weapons, magic ammunition, whetstones, which are a new type of magical item designed to improve weapons, banners, which do play into the banner ability of the commander class, but are not necessarily specific to just the commander. I hope that makes sense. And then a whole host of held and worn items. So when it comes to the equipment section, there are a ton of options, and I guarantee you that player characters are going to find some cool new toys in this section that they're going to have some fun with. The other two things that are going to be covered in this section are siege weapons and battle vehicles. Siege weapons and battle vehicles both have appeared in previous products. First up, we have siege weapons, which originally appeared in Guns and Gears, and one thing I really appreciate about this book is they take the time to actually reprint all of the rules associated with siege weapons. So if you want to use the new siege weapons that are present in Battlecry, you don't also have to go back to Guns and Gears to get all of the rules text from that book. If you don't have Guns and Gears, you can still use siege weapons, just making use of the rules printed here and the various new siege weapons that are included in this book. One of my personal favorites you can see illustrated on this page is the Stacian Sled. This makes use of Stacian technology from Ustalav, straps it to a war sled, and basically gives you this mobile electricity spitter that you can use to fire lightning bolts across the battlefield. Ton of fun if you ask me. And then up next you have the battle vehicle rules, and the rules for vehicles were originally presented in the GM core. The rules for piloting vehicles are not reprinted in this book. I realized that Paizo was probably trying to save some space, but the fact that they reprinted the siege weapon rules but didn't reprint the piloting rules, that bothers me a little bit in this book, but still you get a healthy selection of new vehicles: air vehicles, land vehicles, and sea vehicles. And one thing I do really respect about this book is the healthy diversity of options that are presented. For example, one of the new land vehicles is a medical wagon, which isn't there to offer offensive capability to your PCs, but rather to serve as a mobile medical station that can be used to rescue injured soldiers in a battle. I appreciate the fact that Paizo took the time to think through a lot of different variations of what might be seen in a warfare-style campaign, and I appreciate the fact that they give you a really good variety of options here. If you look down just a bit from the medical wagon, you get the mobile command post, which is another utilitarian vehicle, but still has a lot of practical use if you're doing a war-style campaign. The final chapter is called The Art of War, and this introduces what is called skirmish warfare. And this is about sort of stepping back and taking a larger scale look at the battlefield. Instead of tracking the movements of individual people or creatures on the battlefield, you're instead looking at the movements of larger troops. So if you're interested in doing a story where two different armies are clashing with one another, that is what skirmish warfare is specifically designed to represent. So really quick, Paizo definitely has a lot of options that are already available if you're interested in this style of story. Everything from a level 3 squad of conscripts all the way up to your level 18 Legion of Liches. Paizo's really swinging for some extremes here. Paizo doesn't just give us the rules for how to run skirmish warfare, but they give you a lot of pre-generated options that you can quickly drop into a game to make use of these rules. So as I mentioned, at Gen Con, I actually got to test out the skirmish warfare rules. Paizo had an event called the Battle at Hell Knight Hill, and me and some of my friends got to play in this very large-scale skirmish warfare system. I actually got to see this in action, and I want to give some props to Paizo. They set up a pretty cool experience at Gen Con. They actually had 3 different tables that were running concurrently. I think it was like Gate, Town, and Siege, I think were the different sections, and depending on which section you picked, you would either be battling in the town, trying to take down some siege engines, or trying to storm the gates. Me and my friends, we were actually in the gates section, so we were trying to find a way to breach the Hell Knight Citadel as part of this particular adventure. And I did take a few pictures. I'm going to try to pop them up on screen as I'm talking, but props to Paizo, they definitely had a really, really good setup here. And Paizo actually went the distance with this particular scenario in that the 3 different tables that were running, when you accomplish goals at your table, it actually would like pass buffs over to other tables. So our team was really, really good. We found a way to breach the walls of the Hell Knight Citadel very quickly, and so that passed a buff to the other 2 tables and gave them some significant advantages in the battles they were fighting. And friend of the channel, Hillary Moon Murphy, was helping to run this scenario, so it was also really cool getting to see her in Storyteller mode for all of this. But I do want to say, Paizo gave a pretty solid first impression of how much fun you can have with the skirmish warfare rules, and I also appreciated the demo that they did because it highlighted the fact that even if you're running skirmish warfare rules, you're not necessarily just slamming 2 armies together, but you can set up these skirmishes in a way where you're trying to achieve certain tactical outcomes, meaning you can get a pretty good story going with these rules. I'm not going to dive into how the rules all work here. Instead, I'm going to give a very brief and somewhat oversimplified description of the rules, essentially skirmish warfare is going to function kind of like normal Pathfinder rules without armor class. And I know that sounds a little bit strange, but you have troops, and your troops kind of function like your characters. They will have stats, they'll have certain abilities, but because you're dealing with large-scale groups and what is essentially combat over a large area, essentially everything in skirmish warfare is going to revolve around and resolve by rolling saving throws. So, for example, if my troop of archers fires a volley of arrows, then the other unit that we targeted has to make a reflex save to see how well they avoid those arrows or respond to that attack. And essentially almost all of your offensive abilities are going to play out in that fashion, so it's kind of like a scaled up, if somewhat simplified version of the normal Pathfinder 2e combat rules. I will say I was a little disappointed in the event that Gen Con ran, just because it felt a little too offensive ability oriented in the specific scenario that I played. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. I had a particular troop that I was running, and it had 4 or 5 different abilities that were available to this troop. One of the abilities that I had was called No Retreat or something like that, and basically what it allowed me to do was if another troop tried to run away in a fight, it gave me some special abilities to chase those opponents down, but that ability never came up in the specific scenario that I was playing. Now, to be fair to Paizo, their games were run on an incredibly tight schedule. They were running 3 different tables with multiple troops on every table, and they had to get that whole story done in under an hour, so it kind of makes sense to me that not every ability in skirmish warfare actually came into that particular setup, but it was kind of sad for me that at least in the section I got to play, that I only really got to see the offensive abilities and a few defensive abilities that one of my friends was using with their troops. I only got to see a few things actually play out in the scenario that I ran, but it does look like Paizo has taken the time to include options that are more than just strictly offensive or defensive in their skirmish warfare rules, and I think that if you're a game master running some skirmish warfare at your gaming table, I think it would be pretty easy to build some more complex options, more complex scenarios, and use some more complex tactics in skirmish warfare than what I necessarily saw when I ran through the Battle of Hell Knight Hill at Gen Con. Overall, big takeaway for me, I feel like skirmish warfare is a pretty nice addition to Pathfinder. I don't think it's going to see a lot of use, but as something that pops up 2 or 3 times in a campaign, I think that game masters can use this to build some really interesting scenarios. Like I said, Paizo had a really cool setup for their sample at Gen Con, and I did have a lot of fun with it. And I do think if you're in a scenario where you've got some time to use some of the more complex options that Paizo presents, I do think you could build some pretty interesting, pretty tactical decision-making scenarios into your games. So overall, I think skirmish warfare is a lot of fun, even if it's not necessarily going to see the most use. But that is a quick overview of what you can expect to find inside of Battlecry. Again, my big takeaway is this book is very heavily oriented towards players and player characters. It's got a lot of options that players are going to want to take advantage of, and I think a lot of cool war-themed abilities and items that are worth adding to a campaign. Some of this book is kind of niche. Things like vehicles, siege weapons, and the skirmish warfare rules are not going to fit every story or every table, but I do think there's a lot of stuff in this book, especially the new classes, that could get a lot of mileage at the gaming table, so overall I feel like Paizo did a pretty good job with this product. Still, the time has come for me to turn this conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about Battlecry, and what questions do you have about this product? I do hope to come back and take a deeper look at some of the content in this book in future videos, so if there's something specific you want me to cover more in depth, please let me know and I'll try to add that to my content schedule. Jump down to the comments section, share your questions and thoughts and ideas. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. And while you're doing that, don't forget to do all the other stuff that helps support this channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. All of those links will be in the video description below. But, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.